Okay, I think I might be live. Just got to go through a few procedures here. Just making sure I'm live. I think I am. Sorry I was late, but I had to do a last minute focus. Okay. So now I am going to go over and try and take a picture. Let me just think what I'm doing here. So this is my first live thing that's actually going to work, I think. I was just outside and I can see Neowise through the finder scope, so that's good news. So I will go over to my Acer laptop right now. And take a picture. I might have to change the position a little bit of the telescope. Take a picture first. There it should be. So I don't see much of a trail. So now I just gotta try and get it into the lower left part of the image. So bear with me. That didn't move much. Can't see it in this image. I will change the ISO and the time a little bit. Speed things up. Wrong direction. Okay, what's going on now? Okay, I think I moved it in the wrong direction. I'm just guesstimating right now. So, try again. A little more. If I was outside, it'd be a little faster, but it's slow with this hand control on the screen. And I have no reference. I can't see what I'm doing to make sure it's moving. So you just got to keep taking images until it's lined up. I think I'm going in the wrong direction again. Okay, that makes sense. So So I just hold this down for a few seconds and pray that it doesn't go out of focus or out of the field of view. Try that. KnightMare. At least I can see it, so that's a good sign. And it's semi in focus. If anyone's actually watching. Yep, I'm going in the right direction. The reason I want to go into the lower left part of the viewfinder is to hopefully get the trail. A little more. And I don't even know if it's going to track perfectly with Stellarium. Stellarium can just point to it. It doesn't actually track, from what I've been reading. And I'll just have to do that by hand. That's sort of where I want it. Maybe a little bit to do. This direction now, over to the left, which hopefully is the east. Sometimes these get mixed up. So try that. Okay, that's not too bad. And the stars look like they're focused. So now I'm going to treat a longer exposure here. Try 8. I'll try 8/1600. But eventually I want to stack it. I might not even see the trail tonight. Oh, the trail's over. Looks like it's going the other direction. Try 10 seconds. Try this. It's still a little bit light outside. Usually around 11:30. Yeah, it's still kind of bright. Not much of a trail. So let me just play around with this ISO and exposure time. I'm trying 808. It's a little clearer when the brightness is turned down a bit. I think I'm going to go with 808. I'll just try this one. I like 808. So that's what I'm going to go with. One more try. Okay. Yep. Now I can start. There's where it is between the houses, between the garage and the other person's house. So I still got a little bit of time left, and I don't think I'll be able to be guiding tonight. Let me see if I can see it in the guide scope. I don't think I will be able to. I don't think that's the comet for some reason. And if you guide on a star, it's just well, I won't guide for now. I'll just see. Yeah, the comet's probably off axis, so I won't even probably won't be using that.
Camera connected. Telescope connected.
Try live exposure on this. There's the set so far. Okay. Try again. Yeah, of course you'll never see it in a live image. So I will just start taking pictures at 800 ISO and exposure time of 8 seconds. And then I'll start stacking with this guy. That's first. Here's the Neowise. Just go ahead and edit this. So restart that.
Camera connected. Telescope connected.
One more double check. Okay. RGB and intense luminance is pretty good. So we can start shooting. Okay. 808. To try 80 of them. I don't know. Let's try it. And we'll be guiding by hand, I guess. So maybe if we turn this off.
Guide connection lost.
So I'll try and keep it right to this spot. So I'm just trying to get a mental image of where it is. Okay, let's start taking photos.
Exposure started. Exposure finished.
Okay, that's the first image.
Exposure started. Exposure finished.
Second image. So now I can go over to here and decide what type of stacking I want
Exposure
to do.
started.
And comet
Exposure finished.
is used on, this will have star trails. And it'll be sharper. Well, I'll just try
Exposure
it.
started. Exposure finished. Exposure
Okay,
started.
so that's the last image.
Exposure
Anything
finished.
stacked yet? No. Oh, there's a stack. So it's
Exposure
stacking on the
started.
fly.
Exposure finished.
Looks like it's a little out of focus. This starter.
Exposure started.
Okay, I achieved what I wanted to do. Now I just
Exposure
gotta
finished.
wait.
Exposure started.
So I put it right there, right in the middle every time.
Exposure finished. Exposure started.
I'll see what happens with the stacking.
Exposure
It's at
finished.
9 exposures. This is registering 10,
Exposure started.
11. And this must be a few extras in there.
Exposure finished. Exposure started.
What's the date today? This guy.
Exposure finished. Exposure started.
So yeah, the stars are gonna trail a bit, but hopefully it'll keep the comet in
Exposure finished.
focus. And
Exposure started. Exposure finished. Exposure started.
okay, that's all I really wanted to do.
Exposure finished.
See how many I can get before 11:30. Let's
Deep
see
sky clock
where
vent
it
closing.
is.
Exposure started. Exposure finished.
That's about right. Because
Exposure started. Exposure finished.
yeah, here's where the scope is, the center of the scope.
Exposure started. Exposure finished. Exposure started. Exposure finished. Exposure started.
The edge of the house right here. See,
Exposure
I got
finished.
quite a bit of time left, probably till midnight.
Exposure started.
And it's keeping its
Exposure
position.
finished.
So it's obviously moving the image every time before it's stacking. So the
Exposure
stars might
started.
trail, but the image of the comet will be better, apparently.
Exposure finished.
I will put the mouse here,
Exposure
mouse
started.
pointer, and see how much it moves with every image.
Exposure finished. Exposure started. Exposure finished.
So 23 exposures. I guess I'm going to only go up to 80.
Exposure started.
No hint of a trail tonight.
Exposure finished.
I think it's just too far away from the sun now. Yeah, you can see it slowly moving away
Exposure started.
with every image.
Exposure finished. Exposure started. Exposure finished. Exposure started.
So while this is happening, I think I will
Exposure finished.
be right back.
Exposure started.
I'm just going to go get a drink of water.
Exposure finished. Exposure started. 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 Exposure finished. Expose started. Exposure finished. Exposure 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 started.
Okay.
Exposure finished.
I just went outside to see if I can see it, and I can see it through the finder scope, but I
Exposure
cannot see it
started.
with my naked eye. So it's kind of far away now from the
Exposure
sun,
finished.
but it's closest to the Earth. But not much of a tail. The other night I
Exposure
could see the
started.
tail with my naked eye. Not tonight, and tonight's very clear out.
Exposure finished.
So you can see that it's moved a little bit,
Exposure started.
but live stacking is supposed to take care of that, but
Exposure
I don't
finished.
know if it is. It looks like it's smearing it a bit.
Exposure started.
After 80 images, I'm going to do something different.
Exposure finished. Exposure started. Exposure finished.
Stacked 51.
Exposure started.
So that's the last image. You see there's not much
Exposure
smearing,
finished.
but the stack is starting to smear.
Exposure started.
It's not supposed to do that.
Exposure
So
finished. Exposure started. Exposure finished.
it's kind of boring looking at a
Exposure
blue
started.
dot in the sky.
Exposure finished. Exposure started. Exposure finished. Exposure started. Exposure finished.
Like the algorithm I chose
Exposure started.
for stacking is in here. You go to settings,
Exposure
stacking,
finished.
comet, and you have 3 choices. Standard, comet
Exposure started.
position is ignored. The comet will be fuzzy. Screw that.
Exposure
Comet stacking.
finished.
Comet position is used. The comet will be sharp. No, it's not. And the stars will have trails. Not really.
Exposure started.
Or I can do this. The stars and the comet will be sharp.
Exposure
And it takes twice
finished.
as long, but I don't think that's going to work either.
Exposure started.
I could go back and redo the
Exposure
stacking later.
finished. Exposure started.
Yeah, see, it's just smearing the image. And the stars are not there.
Exposure
So that's not really
finished.
great. That's only used this, well, the first time tonight
Exposure started.
with a comet.
Exposure finished.
I could just go to another algorithm right now. Stop.
Exposure started. Exposure
I'll try
finished.
the other algorithm. Where is this?
Exposure started.
I'll try this one.
Exposure finished.
And I think I'll just erase all these first.
Exposure started.
Actually, everything. Just delete it. Oop, except
Exposure finished.
I don't want to delete the images.
Exposure started.
I can delete that.
Exposure finished.
This one delete.
Exposure started.
I do want to delete.
Exposure finished.
This stuff.
Exposure started.
How about I don't do anything and just see how it does.
Exposure finished. Exposure started.
70 images. Okay, let's redo the whole thing.
Exposure finished.
So it's just going to start stacking everything with this other
Exposure
algorithm,
started.
which apparently will keep the stars sharp and the comet sharp.
Exposure finished. Exposure.
No, I see it smearing already. No,
Exposure finished.
the live
Started.
stacking doesn't work very great. And part of the reason is because the comet is actually moving.
Exposure finished.
But here, even look at the stars. They should not be split
Exposure
like
started.
that. But I know if I do it in the non-live, this is
Exposure
Deep
finished.
Sky Stacker Live. If I do it with this, just the regular one, it'll move the images and plop them right
Exposure
on
started.
top when they stack. So I check that. The live one isn't that good with comments.
Exposure finished.
So the last image is nice and circular.
Exposure started.
Well, here it's not too bad, but
Exposure finished.
you can see that it's moved a bit. I think
Exposure started. Deep Sky Clock event. Exposure finished.
so. After 5 more images,
Exposure started.
here's the timer right up
Exposure finished. Exposure started. Exposure finished. Exposure started.
Oh, too bad the Orion Nebula wasn't
Exposure
up
finished.
this time of year. Kind of gotta wait till around November. But that's what this will be
Exposure
really good
started.
for, the live stacking. I could live stack a star, but it's just a dot.
Exposure finished.
So this is done. Last image.
Exposure started.
It's here. This should,
Exposure finished. Imaging plan finished.
Plan. Let's see. So this is still stacking. It is a little better now. Let's see, here's the score. $30, $31. That's a better score. Full width half max. Relatively good. Number of stars. I don't know how I can find that many stars, but it's pretty consistent. DXDY, that's how much it's moved. So, in this first, and that's a weird position over there. But it looks like it's not moving much. Angle. Not a lot of movement. Sky background. I don't really know what that means. Here's an image list, log. That's starting to smear them again. Well, that's why I did this for a test. A star is supposed to twinkle right on my forehead. It's a red light. Well, I'll go back again. It's not doing a great job stacking because it's not tracking properly. There is a way to track it manually. I just wanted to do this and see. Let me get out of this program and reconnect this guy. Oh, look at that little streak. I wonder if that's a meteor or a jet trail. Let's see, take another picture. Looks like a meteor went by. $6,500. It's going to stack about 7 more. It doesn't look like a nice round comet. So the live stacking isn't as good as I thought. It's just because it's not tracking that well. And I can't use the guide star because the guide stars move at a different rate. It's the last one. That's done. Try increasing this for 10 seconds. I don't know why it keeps going back like that. Do I see a bit of a tail? No. I'm just looking at the screen here. I think I am going to end this soon. I could go look over at our Taurus. I don't know why I would want to, but why not? Okay, I'll swing over to our Taurus. Should be coming into view here. There it should be. This one I'll center. And just take a few images of it. See, the ISS is going to go overhead in 10 minutes. Too bad. I wasn't outside, I could track it. I'll sync it. Now here I can track. Or use the guide camera. I'll guide on this star. I'm going to turn down the gain a bit. You don't want big fat stars, you want small itsy bitsy ones that you can hardly see. That's even too high. Let's lower the gain a little bit more. That's how you have to do it. So if I auto select, well, I'm going to start guiding on this. We put this right in the center again first. So now I'm guiding. I'm using a hysteresis mode, which I don't know how to pronounce it. Hysteresis, hysteresis. And it takes about one cycle of the worm gears to model the worm gear error. It's called the periodic error. And I already have the periodic error correction recorded in my mount on the telescope, but this adds to it, so it improves it a little bit. But it takes about one cycle, which usually takes about 10 minutes, but it keeps getting better and better and better after that time. And that's good. Search region 12, that's that little box, this box here. And this red line represents the declination, and blue the red ascension. And you hope after a little while they both run straight across here. So the declination is really good. Just the red ascension. Oh, and I know why, because I have the setting in my handheld thing outside that you can have, when you track, you can have red ascension and declination, have them both turned on. Usually I only need the red ascension turned on, and then it tracks better for some reason. But wait, we'll just see what happens here. After a few minutes, it might do okay. And as you can see, that this will probably stay right there. And so while that's happening, I can now exit out of here. And go to astrophotography tools.
Camera connected. Telescope connected.
Now this guide thing will show up here. It's the guide program that I'm using. This thing. And here's the scatter plot. So you can see these changes. box is bigger than normal. As you see, this is the red ascension, and that's the declination. So the declination is not moving too much, mostly red ascension. And yeah, ooh, it's not great. But let's see the live view. I just cranked up so much. I'll take a shot. You can see the RGB now. That's pretty good. Let's see. For 10 seconds. Pretty much the same. So I can do this. I'll just wait 800 again. And this time I can stack it with this thing. Remove those other images first. So a temporary folder. Call it Comet. There. So now I can do the live stacking again. I'm here. Let me just see the guiding first. Yeah, so it's improving a little bit. The declination really is wild here. Yikes. I think something's not perfect, but good enough. So now I can start this plan. Ooh.
Exposure started.
So I'm going to stop and start it over. Because I didn't have the anti-vibration on for the mirror, where it flips up on the DSLR camera.
Camera connected. Telescope connected.
There. Okay, I can do this now. True North cars, plan, start.
Exposure started.
Okay, got one
Exposure
image.
finished.
So I'll start this deep stacker live up. You have one
Exposure
image
started.
in the monitor. Do you want to process sound? Sure.
Exposure finished.
There's the last image. Now this should improve the signal noise ratio because it's going to track and not move a lot.
Exposure started.
It has to get 3 before it starts. What did I set it at?
Exposure
Don't stack
finished.
until at least 3. Shape stack image to each 5 images. Got 3, so it should be a stack. Yeah. So that's
Exposure
stack.
started.
That's the actual image, last image. This is stacked. So now this should improve the
Exposure
signal to noise
finished.
ratio every time. Let me just double check the guiding again. It sucks. But it should get better
Exposure
over
started.
time. It's also not the best
Exposure finished.
star. It's too big. It's moving around too much. But it's good enough because when you stack it, it should realign close enough.
Exposure started.
Another thing I want to try, and then I'm probably going to end this.
Exposure finished.
This box, it says 355 degrees. That was the last time I took. So yeah,
Exposure started.
you can go to gear, point craft,
Exposure finished.
scope, position, and select an object. Actually, no, I'll just do this auto. It's going to solve
Exposure started.
this image and tell me what it is, and it'll tell what the rectangle rotation is
Exposure
of the camera.
finished.
So let's see. Well, you can't do it all.
Exposure started.
Can I pause this? And pause it.
Exposure finished.
Paused. Gear. Point craft. Scope position. Auto. Please stop the execution running. Ugh. Okay, I'll stop the whole thing. So, I am going to go over here again and get rid of all those images and start over. Oops. Over here. No big. So it's at 355 degrees. It's tracking a little better actually, but not great. Stop this. But yeah, so I go to astrophotography tools.
Camera connected. Telescope connected.
guiding, okay. So I just want to check out. It'll give me a proper alignment of the box, the rotation of the camera. There, now it's imaging. So it's going to run for probably, I don't know what, I think I have it set for 20 seconds.
Exposure started.
That first 5 was the anti-vibration.
Exposure
Got the
finished.
image. There it is. Now it's going to try and solve it. Just should take there.
Image solved.
And then it automatically puts that rotation into Stellarium. And what does it say now? 357.5. So yeah, that's the proper rotation angle of the DSLR camera. Just another tool. I like that. So now I can start doing the live images again. Start this. Let me just check on the guideline. Ooh, it's getting better. So maybe it's good that I waited. So start. First 5 seconds, I think, is the anti-vibration. 8 seconds.
Exposure
Oh,
started.
that was the right anti-vibration. There's a first to 5 second delay. So now it's 8 seconds. The first image.
Exposure finished.
First image is there. Start up this. Start stacking.
Exposure started.
It's going to wait for 3 images, and then it'll start
Exposure finished.
putting the stack in here. There.
Exposure started.
Look at the difference. It's a little brighter. I don't know if that's good or bad.
Exposure finished.
Less signal, better signal to noise ratio. Look at that nice spike.
Exposure started.
I think that's really in focus.
Exposure finished.
So it'll be a while before Arcturus goes
Exposure
behind the
started.
house. But
Exposure finished.
this is what I wanted to test out. So I'm almost going to end this.
Exposure started.
I can sync here. Yeah.
Exposure finished.
So guiding isn't the best, but it's doing okay. Here's the scatter
Exposure
plot. It's
started.
really kind of, usually you want it in this one little circle in the gray thing here. That would be really good. But this star is kind
Exposure
of too big.
finished.
So, got 7 exposures.
Exposure
Here's the
started.
guide. RGB, luminance.
Exposure finished.
It's the last image. Let's check these graphs.
Exposure started.
Full width half max. Number of stars. I don't know how I can find that many
Exposure
stars.
finished.
That's the difference in the dx dy. The angle,
Exposure
so
started.
that's not too bad. Last image.
Exposure finished.
So you can see the chromatic aberration
Exposure started.
in the stacked image. There's less chromatic aberration.
Exposure finished.
And that's showing it's doing a good thing. And Arcturus is a double star.
Exposure started. Exposure finished.
That is good spike, nice focus.
Exposure started. Exposure finished.
So everything's working. Just the comet didn't track very well. There's a way to do it.
Exposure started.
And sort of shown here. It's comet
Exposure
tracking
finished.
tools. You have to put it in manually. The right ascension and declinations, the drift kind of. But I probably
Exposure
just could have moved
started.
it manually between shots. Would have been better. And not use the automatic
Exposure finished.
thing here. Just take an image, move it to the right position again, take an image, move it to the right position again, take an image, move it to the right position again. And then it would have done a better job of less smearing.
Exposure started.
That's about all I wanted to test out, so I'm going to probably shut down now.
Exposure finished.
I'll go up to 20 images.
Exposure
And then
started.
shut things down.
Exposure finished.
So you can see the guiding's improving after about 10 minutes. It gets better and better. I think my periodic error
Exposure
one
started.
gear cycle is about 10 minutes. It's not the best tracking though, the declination.
Exposure finished.
I know why I have this other switch that I should have turned off. But I have to go outside, it's just a test anyways.
Exposure started. Exposure finished.
Just checking the temperature of the sensor. It's 27 degrees all the way through here.
Exposure started.
At least it's stable. I think this is the last image and I'll stop.
Exposure finished.
It's guiding better. But it's time to go to bed. Let's see how the stack finished. The last image was good. don't know that's stock, but we'll try. Good enough for now. I'm going to shut these things down. Just play around a little bit. Okay. Note to sign off here. I think that's it. So I will end here.